Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The unfolding war between Israel and Hamas has exposed fissures within Australian society over Zionism and anti-Semitism. Such views challenge the history of Australia's relationship with Israel since its inception 75 years ago at the United Nations. It was Labor's External Affairs Minister, HV Doc Evatt, who presided over the 1949 General Assembly vote admitting Israel as a UN member state, while then opposition leader Robert Menzies reflected that Israel's creation was a shining symbol of delivery from bondage and, I believe, of world repentance. Joining me to discuss the history of Australia-Israel relations is Executive Director of Plus 61J Media, Dr Dashiel Lawrence. Dash is the author of Australia and Israel, a diasporic political and cultural relationship. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Dash.
Hi, Georgina. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's lovely to have you, but it's an incredibly difficult time, of course, for the Australian Jewish community and community more broadly, not least by what is taking place in Israel, but also what's happening here in Australia and the very concerning reactions across our population. I wondered if you could provide some reflections on what the last 3.5 weeks have been like for the community who the media outlet you run represents.
Yeah, look, very difficult to summarise it, but I'll try my best. Essentially, I think you're seeing a lot of trauma, devastation, a lot of distress at the events of the 7th of October, and obviously the implications of that attack and the violence that is unfolding and the war that the State of Israel now finds itself in. I think the Australian Jewish community has quite a profound connection with the State of Israel and has for the entirety of the state's history, and Australian Jews have in large part always regarded themselves as Zionist and have felt a very special connection with Israel, such that whenever Israel is attacked or in danger, they feel as if their own lives are at risk. That's borne out in survey data. And so naturally, when you have an attack of this size, this scale, with the kind of violence that was meted out to Israelis on the 7th of October, what you're getting is a traumatized response and a feeling of incredible insecurity. And I obviously in many different WhatsApp groups and hearing lots of different views and reflections from people from across the political divide, I might add, from those that perhaps may have been quite critical of Israel in the past or found themselves voicing a lot of opposition to the state's policies, through to those ardently supportive of the State of Israel and its government. So I've been hearing from a raft of people, and almost uniformly, I think there is a shock at the response from sections of the Australian population, from politicians through to media, through to civil societies and groups, the ways that they have been silent in responding to the events, the ways that they have not extended condolences, the ways that they have not extended compassion, but in some instances stepping up and immediately calling for a cessation of hostilities, immediately saying that Israel is engaging in genocidal acts, immediately calling out Israel's response. And I think they quite naturally feel, where is the care for Israeli lives? Where is the care for Jewish lives? So that response has been uniform across the community, from all sections of the community that I know and connect with. And naturally, the Jewish community organisations and the Zionist leadership is now doing all it can to represent the interests of its community and to be in solidarity with the State of Israel.
It's interesting, the Australian Jewish community, different from other Jewish communities around the world, is much more Zionist. And so you get much more of a sense here, I think, than in other countries of that attachment to Israel as the promised land, the homeland of the Jewish people. And you also, of course, have the children, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors very highly represented here, perhaps different from other countries around the world. So there is that trauma that is being passed down through the generations. Very few, of course, Holocaust survivors still alive to this day, but their children are and grandchildren, of course. So that must be an even more difficult position to be in, having that history.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes, Israel and Zionism really does infuse Jewish life. Australia's home to a very vibrant Zionist youth movements, play a huge role in the lives of many young Australian Jews growing up. If you attend a Jewish day school in this country, you are absolutely going to learn about the state of Israel and grow to have some connection and affection for it. And similarly, you will grow up with a very strong understanding of the Holocaust, as you say, by virtue of the very large number of Holocaust survivors who were settled here in Australia and their descendants. And those three pillars, Zionism, Israel, and the Holocaust, are and have always been major pillars of Australian Jewish communal life. And while the relationship with Israel has fluctuated, and I think that in the last couple of decades you've seen Australian Jews expressing new and different relationships with Israel that didn't need to be meted through or mediated by established organisations, and so therefore able to have perhaps a more nuanced relationship with Israel. I would say that even despite perhaps the opposition to many of the policies of the current Israeli government, there is still a connection there that is very powerful.
Before we get on to a discussion of contemporary relations between Australia and Israel, particularly government to government or relations at international organisations level, I think it's important to understand how connected Australia is to the birth of Israel as a state in 1948. Can you tell me about what was happening in the mid-40s? I mean, we're just in the very, very last days of World War II. What was happening here with the Australian Jewish community and its lobbying of the Australian government, which, of course, played such an important role at the UN forming the State of Israel. I think we're called the surrogate midwife of the State of Israel.
Yes, Australia did play a very important role in the establishment of the state, and you're right, you do trace it back to the 1940s, really, when what was quite a small then Zionist movement, the Australian Jewish community at that point was sort of largely assimilationist, Anglo-Jewish, not particularly Zionistic, but there was this budding Zionist movement that was emerging in the 1930s and 1940s. And among that movement, among those leaders that were working behind the scenes to win support for the Zionist aims and objectives in politics and in civil life and across the general population, there were a few leaders who really zoned in on a couple of targets, if you like. One of those leaders was quite an extraordinary man, Max Freilich, who was born in Poland, educated in Vienna, and arrived in Australia in the 1920s. And through a friendship he had with a Jewish parliamentarian, New South Wales parliamentarian, Abe Lander, he was introduced to Doc Evatt. And Doc Evatt, just a most amazing man who obviously was initially first a state parliamentarian in New South Wales, then went on to become a High Court judge at the age of 36. And then by the 1940s had decided that actually he was done with the High Court and he was more interested in other things. So off he went to federal parliament. He was introduced to Freilich and a number of other Zionist leaders. And they were of the view, Freilich was of the view, that those connections that they forged with him proved to be very important, and that from their very first meetings with Evatt, that Evatt indicated that when the time would come, if there was ever an opportunity for a state of Israel to be established, that his actions would would contribute in some way. And so Freilich took him on his word and felt that there was a very warm, supportive relationship there. I think they had a couple of other meetings over the following years, as obviously Australia and the world were in the midst of a war, so there was no possible resolution at this point. But after the war, with the formation of the United Nations and Everett's ascendancy, by that stage he was External Affairs Minister, a big role to play in the United Nations. United Nations effectively given this very difficult, vaunted task of how to resolve this mess that was the British Mandate of Palestine. And it was Everett, it would seem, who played a vital role in bringing some kind of resolution to the question of what to do with the British Mandate of Palestine. Ultimately, I should mention that he was chairman of the ad hoc committee, which was a committee formed to essentially look at the two possible pathways or future for the mandate. It was decided that the mandate should end, and so it was a question of what is it replaced by. And Everett really worked assiduously to get through a recommendation of partition, of the creation of a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And it seems, I've been kind of going over some of his writings and memories of the time, that it was, as you can imagine, the sort of thing that appeared to topple over at any point. And if were it not for him and his commitment to seeing through that there would be a partition plan, it's quite possible that there would never have been a vote on such a plan, a partition, and therefore ultimately never a state of Israel being established.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, I think you're right that Doc Everett saw Palestine being turned into a Jewish state and partitioned as the only logical moral way of dealing with Jewry post-Holocaust. And we're dealing with a time when there was a massive number of displaced people out of Europe, but also the aftermath of the death of 6 million European Jews. And I mean, as I mentioned in my introduction, this is Robert Menzies, who's opposition leader at the time, was in full agreement with Doc Everett, who becomes president of the General Assembly, the first president of the new General Assembly of the United Nations, that this was a way of the world repenting for the horrors of the Holocaust. So in the years after that, how did Australia navigate its relationship with this new state of Israel? Things weren't very straightforward, clearly, for Israel. There's been quite a few wars with its neighbours, particularly, of course, the Suez Crisis, which Australia was involved in. But how did that relationship evolve, do you think, Dash?
Yeah, well, even back to the First World War, when Australian Light Horse Brigades fought alongside and encountered, in a friendly, warm sense, local Jewish members of the Yishuv, the pre-State of Israel Jewish community. And on both accounts, it would seem that there were warm relations developed between Australians and Jews in Israel at that point. And so there had already been some notion that Australians were warm and predisposed to supporting Jewish people in Israel. And so by the time Everett steps up and helps navigate through to the partition plan and ultimately the establishment of the State of Israel through the General Assembly, there is this sort of recognition that Australia has been there for Israel, that there is this history of a warm friendship, there is some connected past. And so, look, the Suez Canal crisis, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately, you did have Australia and Israel effectively on the same side by virtue of the fact that they were in conflict with Egypt. How much was the Menzies government? Where was his, ultimately, I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that his interests were primarily in serving the British and what was strategically of interest and value to them, and that just so happened to align with Israel as well. I don't profess to be an expert on Menzies or Menzian politics, but certainly it does seem that through that period, there was just this general continuation of those warm relations, a positive regard for the State of Israel, recognition that Australia had played that role at the United Nations. And that probably carried on through the 1960s. Certainly in 1967, there was uniform view of support politically in Australia for Israel's position. What happened after that? It's quite interesting.
Just before you
sure.
go on to that, Dash, though, I think the Suez Crisis is quite an important moment to reflect on because, of course, you have Melbourne Olympics in 1956, the same year as the Suez Crisis. And Egypt, Iraq and Lebanon boycott the Olympics to protest the invasion of Egypt by France and Israel. And, of course, Menzies in Australia and the UK and these 5 nations are putting together a real delegation that is led by Menzies to protest to President Nasser the nationalisation of the Suez Canal by Egypt. But you have Israel participating in the Olympics too at the same time and I think doing quite well. So there was this sense in Australia of the importance of Israel and the Australian Jewish community too, taking pride in Israel's invasion of Egypt at the Sinai Peninsula and the military effectiveness of the Israeli Defence Force at the time.
Yeah.
And that real sense of Zionism was quite on the rise during that period.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Georgina. The 56 Suez Canal crisis, as seen from the point of view of the Australian Jewish community, was very significant because here was this newly established state already in the midst of another crisis, and great efforts were put into, for the very first time, into the public relations and the question of advocacy here in Australia. Izzy Liebler, then a very young businessman, but with interests politically and interests obviously in the protection and the advocacy of the State of Israel, made it clear that Israel needed to be defended in Australia. There needed to be investment in a public relations department. I can't remember the name of this particular department that he established. But in addition to that, you had the first large-scale fundraisers, the kinds of fundraisers we're currently seeing in Australia, where you've got everything from challah sales, cakes, baking sales, through to big, much more organised Jewish National Fund fundraisers and United Israel Appeals. Those things really were seen for the very first time in 1956, where Australian Jews held their sort of collective breath at what was going to happen to Israel. And then you're right, soon after the crisis ended, there was the 1956 Olympic Games, and Israel sent out a small deputation, mostly actually of administrators and team officials rather than athletes. But nevertheless, those that were there were warmly embraced on their arrival, and the 2 weeks or so that they spent in Melbourne at the time, the reports were of them almost being sort of mobbed at any public event in the Jewish community. People were just sort of so excited that there was these representatives of Israel here in Australia. So there's a real energy around Israel in 56.
There's a lovely quote here from the then chair of the Jewish Women's Organisations of Melbourne, Julia Rapke, who says, "We Jews are not a martial people, but the way Israel acquitted herself in battle sheds pride and glory on every Jewish man, and every Jewish woman must prove strong and true, just as Israel has proved herself strong and true." So that strong connection between Australian Jewry and the fate of Israel, and Israel being able to stand up for itself, was very, very much apparent then.
Yes.
But what do you think since then have been the biggest tests in the relationship? Because it has been tested.
Yes.
It's not always smooth sailing.
No.
And particularly the way Australia has positioned itself at the United Nations, where the position of Israel has always been under great pressure, despite the UN being so important to the founding of Israel.
Yes.
Oh,
Absolutely.
the irony.
Yeah. Things changed over time, didn't they? So Whitlam's a really interesting one because prior to his election, he had, on his account, known every single Labor Prime Minister and Israeli Labor Prime Minister.
Because Israel had traditionally been seen as quite a left-leaning country. Yeah. Politics was pretty socialistic,
left,
and it, I guess, come out of those traditions in Europe.
Yes, social democracy, absolutely. Yeah, with a very strong Labor Party, trade union movement, and of course an amazing network of collectivist communities, farms, the kibbutzim. So like many in the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party and of the left who had visited Israel, Whitlam was also sort of caught up in and won over by Israel during his visits in the 1960s. But then when he became Prime Minister, things started to change. It became more complicated. And by the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Whitlam's position on Israel had changed to the point where he made it clear that Australia should be adopting an approach of even-handedness and of neutrality.
So that was a big shift.
It was, yeah. And I think it probably took Jewish community leaders and Zionist leaders by shock, because they had known Whitlam to be very supportive of Israel. They knew that he had spent time there. They knew that he knew the Labor prime ministers. And so then when he adopts this attitude, when Israel was in serious trouble in the 1973 war, it looked as if it could very well be crushed. And so this idea that what had been up until that point a supporter, a friend of Israel, that the Prime Minister would then approach this question from the point of view of even-handedness and neutrality, it was shocking. And the relationship between Whitlam and the Jewish community never really quite recovered. And in turn, it seems that Whitlam was much more interested in trying to open up the dialogue with PLO. It appears that Whitlam was also very interested in thinking about the Arab world, about trade opportunities, but also about the way that Arab constituents looked upon this issue. So up until that point, the electorate had a relatively small number of Arab constituents. And then by the time that Whitlam was Prime Minister, that had started to change.
Right.
I was reading his memoir recently, and he basically makes the point that at that juncture, Jews accounted for almost the same number of Arabs in Australia. And so I think there was a point where he was looking at this from a pragmatic perspective, which is quite a different shift, and I guess comes in some ways with the political reality of being a leader and weighing up interests.
All the different races and ethnicities within your electorate.
Yes.
I mean, it is interesting that he does go to great lengths to open a dialogue with the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, where they are attempting to set up a PLO office. It doesn't happen, but that must have taken the Jewish community by surprise, but also really, really disappointed them. And I think Whitlam was pretty sensitive to what was going on in the international organisations, where the UN in 1974 recognises the PLO as the sole representatives of the Palestinian people. Is he wanting the Labor government to stay in step with that growing legitimisation of the Palestinian cause, despite the fact that, 25 years before Doc Evatt, who he knew and he would have served with, had set up Israel with others. What about the impact of the 1997 Maccabi Games, when several Australian athletes were walking over collapsed?
Yes. Yeah, nearly about 100 or so athletes and officials. So for those who don't know, the Maccabi Games is kind of like the Jewish Olympics. It happens every 4 years in Israel. It's a big gathering mostly of amateur athletes, but it also serves for Jewish communities a very important bridging and bonding with Israel, particularly for those parts of the community that may not necessarily be politically involved or involved in many other ways with Israel. And in 1997, during the opening ceremony, the Australian delegation walked across a shoddily made bridge, which was essentially subcontracted out to a company that had never constructed bridges like this before. And the bridge collapsed and not everyone fell into the water. I believe Josh Frydenberg was actually there on that day, and I don't believe he was one that fell into the water, but was certainly one there to render assistance to those that did. There were 4 deaths, but many more injured, sustaining really, really horrible injuries, some of which they still carry today. And on that evening, the Games ceremony continued, which is just shocking that there was this loss of life outside the stadium. And the ceremony continued, and the Australian delegation obviously was just shocked and appalled by the response from the Games organisers. And that confusion and that shock at the way that the Games organisers responded really continued on for the subsequent months and years, as there was almost a silence and a refusal by almost anyone to take responsibility. This negligently, shoddily constructed bridge that had caused these deaths, people obfuscated their responsibilities, and it took a very long time for compensation to be paid. In fact, it required a small number of very frustrated but very persistent Jewish community leaders to get a compensation paid, an acknowledgement of what had happened, and ultimately there was some imprisonments that were handed down. But along the way, Australian Jews, for the very first time, looked at Israel from a new light and felt, as one leader told me at the time, that he said it left a very bad taste in our mouths.
Yeah, that Israel had let the Australian Jewish community down on that occasion.
And after all we've done, is what they would have said at the time, after all we've done, after all the money that we've given, after all of the support that we've given and work we've done to advocate for Israel in Australia, our people are treated in this way. And you did see a decline in donations to Israel. You did see a drop in the number of visitors from Australia to Israel in the years that followed. And the relationship, well, for some people, it has never recovered. For some people, I think for the most part, it recovered a few years after, and donations returned, and relations at an official level did absolutely recover. But certainly some people have never forgotten it.
Of course, fast forward to 2010, there was the revelation, and it was, I mean, goodness, is that like out of an episode of Fauda or a James Bond movie, where it was discovered that Israel's intelligence organisation Mossad had used Australian passports in an assassination of a Hamas operative, I think in the United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
The assassination took place. And the Labor Foreign Affairs Minister at the time, Stephen Smith, he expelled an Israeli diplomat, and he angrily declared that these are not the actions of a friend.
That's right.
That was a low point for Australia-Israel relations, whether or not it played out in the Australian Jewish community per se and their perceptions of Israel. They maybe had some sympathy that a Hamas operative was assassinated. I don't know, but there have been some bumps along the way.
There have,
yes.
Yeah. Apparently, I learned recently that wasn't the first time that Mossad had used Australian passports, and that they were caught out in 2003, and that the then Director General of ASIO took this evidence to Mossad and to the Israeli intelligence agencies and wrapped them over the knuckles and made them essentially sign an agreement saying that they would never do it again. And so when they did do it again in 2010, Dennis Richards, I think is his name, by that time, Secretary of Department of Foreign Affairs gave advice to then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and Foreign Affairs Minister Stephen Smith that essentially you need to come down hard on them this time. And so they did. Some would say expelling a member of Mossad who's part of the Israeli embassy is not coming down hard enough, but it was actually quite as strong of an expression of frustration as you would get. And Smith did say, as you said, these are not the actions of a friend. And there were some repercussions. So, yes, Jewish leadership privately took this up with Smith and with Rudd and were very angry at the way that they publicly admonished Israel for this. And also the Israeli ambassador also, by Rudd's account at least, really put him in the doghouse. So there was this pushing back both from the Jewish community and naturally from the Israeli embassy here in Australia. But that did pass, and really since then there has continued to be this expression of goodwill, of warm relations, of friendship.
Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, when he first is elected in late 2007, he says as one of his foreign policy priorities he would like Australia to be elected to the United Nations Security Council, one of the rotating spots on there, and goes on a massive wooing campaign of all the members of the United Nations, which there are, I think, 192 or so. And a lot of those members, this is UN politics, are pro the Palestinian cause and very, very sceptical or anti the Israeli cause. So that has also influenced, hasn't it, the Australian government's position on Israel. I mean, Rudd becomes much more critical of Israel than his predecessor John Howard had been. And UN politics does matter to some prime ministers, to some Australian governments, more than others.
Definitely. And the same for Bob Carr, who briefly served as foreign minister as well. And he had previously been quite a strong supporter of Israel, regarded himself as an advocate for Jewish community interests in Australian politics. And so, yeah, it seems particularly for members of the Australian Labor Party that it is a difficult balancing act. And then when it comes to the UN, sometimes when these resolutions are raised, instead of voting against resolutions that are condemning Israel, the approach has been to abstain.
Yeah, and this, of course, has just happened in the last week or so with Australia abstaining on a vote calling for an immediate humanitarian truce. So it hasn't voted against this, and the concern was that the resolution didn't adequately criticise the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. It was a bit too, I guess, neutral on the Hamas terrorist attacks. And the concern in the Australian Jewish community is Australia shouldn't just abstain, it should vote against these resolutions. But this has represented, I think, a shift in this sort of new Australian government, the Albanese government, where they've even changed their recognition of the West Bank to occupy Palestinian territory rather than occupied territories, which again represents a bit of a departure from the bipartisan support for the state of Israel.
Yeah, this is a really curious, interesting one to observe, the way that the Labor Party now finds itself trying to continue this bipartisan relationship that, as we've been talking about, it owns by virtue of the
legacy of Evatt.
The legacy of Evatt.
Yes.
And yet, when it finds itself in office, as was the case with Whitlam, and we haven't even talked about Hawke, but it was the case with Hawke and with Rudd and with Carr, and now again with Albanese, supported by Penny Wong, by Senator Wong, it finds itself in a difficult position where, on the one hand, it professes to be a friend of Israel, supportive of the state, and yet it also at times has had to balance that out with the reality that the international community is increasingly opposed to Israel, certainly at the United Nations level, that there are a much large proportion of Islamic voters in Australia, and you see that being brought out in the past few days with the comments from Tony Burke, who represents a seat that I believe almost 1 in 4 people in his electorate are Islamic, and for Ed Husic, both of whom, in addition to Anne Ali, have made comments that really call the government to attention to the views of Palestinian Australians, Islamic Australians, who want this government to adopt a much harder take on Israel.
Dash, is it possible to separate anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism? Because what has been really shocking for me as a non-Jewish member of the Australian community is to see the conflation of the two, that people who are opposed to what Israel is doing to attack Hamas in Gaza, there is an element who are then focusing on Jewish people and Jewish identity and taking out their anger on the Jewish race, which to me is they're entirely separate issues. But then you see the connection with the Australian Jewish community with Zionism and with Israel, and you can see that they are so intricately intertwined that it is hard to run a parallel argument there. Yeah.
It's been said before by many others, and I believe it to be true, that not all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and not all anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, although there's often a very strong overlap. And in recent weeks, it's been very disturbing to see at pro-Palestinian rallies chants of "Gas the Jews" and "Death to the Jews," and signs with Nazi imagery and symbols, and some really deplorable expressions of anti-Semitism So I have to say I've been shocked by that expression, and also the sort of loss of humanity, the loss of recognition of what had happened on the 7th of October, the total silence, particularly from the progressive and left-wing parts of Australia, civil organisations and the Australian Greens, this kind of failure to recognise that these 200 plus people that have been kidnapped were just going about their day on an ordinary Saturday, and their lives are somehow, they can be relativised, or that there's a context for that kind of kidnapping.
That they had it coming, or
or that we need to look at the historical reasons for this.
Dash, we've talked about the change in the Australian government's position on Israel, particularly with the election of the Whitlam government in 1972. And then, of course, when Israel, the Likud party, which is a right-leaning party, is elected in 77, you again have that reinforcement that the left of Australian politics is not so enamoured with the Israeli political class, well, at least when the elected government is Likud or centre-right or right-wing parties. But are we inheriting in Australia the global left's distaste for Israel, or do you think it is organic in Australia? Because it does seem like the Palestinian cause is caught up in left-wing movements and the Israeli cause, I mean, irrespective of what Jewish people in Australia vote, and they're of all, as you said earlier, they're of all political colours. It's irrelevant when it comes to their attachment to Zionism. But we do see that bifurcation along left-right divide for support for Israel or not. And I wonder if that's more an international phenomenon that's been implanted in Australia, or do we have some organic evolution of it through changes in our population, through Arab Muslim migration and the like?
You might be right. The events of the past few weeks may have radically changed all of this, because it used to be that this conflict wasn't necessarily a question of right and left. At one point in our history, there were plenty of left-wing activists that supported the state of Israel and felt that didn't have to clash with Palestinian calls for the establishment of a state. I would say one thing that has made it very difficult is the growth of settlements in the West Bank. And so with the growth of those settlements, it has given the possibility of a two-state solution. Has made it more and more difficult.
And that's been facilitated by the right of Israeli politics, hasn't
it? Correct. And that process began from 77, from the election of the Likud government, and under Begin and successive governments since then, obviously with great attention to the current Prime Minister and the current government, those settlements have grown and spread. And so left-wing people of the kind of the progressive left, naturally, if they also support a two-state solution, also want to see the end of those settlements. I don't know if that answers your question, but there is some context as to how the left, if we can speak so generally, have come to fall out of love with Israel.
Yeah.
That is one of the things you can raise.
And it presents a very complicated picture for the Australian Jewish community.
Yes.
Who don't necessarily want to sit within that political paradigm.
Yeah, particularly I know many of Australian Jews that regard themselves of the left and strongly supportive of lots of left-wing causes, and feel very uncomfortable with the establishment of those settlements, and also want the Palestinians to have their home. But they're also shocked and appalled at the way that their non-Jewish counterparts are responding to the events of the past few weeks.
Yes. Yeah.
And so what does that lead to? Does that lead to the, as you say, a kind of a complete split or cleavage between left and right, Israel and Palestinian? I'm not sure. Look, there is one other thing I wanted to add to this conversation, Georgina, and that is that despite what we've seen on our television screens and we read about, when asked in surveys consistently across the course of the last 60 plus years, Australians have generally not sided in great numbers with either the Israelis or the Palestinians. Right? So I think it's really important to mention that, because anyone who thinks that Australia is somehow, Australians as a people are somehow becoming increasingly captive to the Palestinian cause, they might want to just remember that that doesn't bear out in the survey data. My organisation, +61J, ran the largest poll on this question in 2021 when the Social Research Centre, we partnered with them and we surveyed nearly 3,500 Australians.
Right.
And we asked the question, regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who do your sympathies mainly lie with? And in response to that, 11% said Israelis, 19% said Palestinian, and 62% said equally with both.
Interesting.
So, really the vast majority of the Australian public
are pretty neutral.
And when you ask them about their level of knowledge of or awareness of Australia's foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine,
so it'd be pretty thin.
They basically admit that they know virtually nothing or very little at all.
Yeah.
Wow. So I think we need to keep that in perspective for those that feel that Australians might be shifted greatly in light of the events of the past few weeks. They probably won't be, but certainly at the level of the media, at the level of the sort of progressive left-wing parts of the Australian public, it's going to be interesting to observe how things unfold over the coming period.
Indeed. Well, Dash, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's a powerful conversation about an incredibly important contemporary issue, but also I think it's important for people to understand how long Australia has had a deep relationship with the State of Israel, despite not having very strong trade links and being thousands of kilometres apart. We were there at the beginning, and I hope that everyone can get through the next few weeks and let's be honest, probably months through this crisis with minimal loss of life. And I hope these disturbing trends of rising anti-Semitism are but a blip in the good relations Australia normally has with its Jewish community. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.